8.3 trigonometry. This is the meat potatoes of trigonometry. It's going to be your lifeline, always resorting back to this information when you're doing trigonometry in your more advanced classes. So what trigonometry is, it's basically when you have similar right triangles. So when you have angles that are congruent in triangles, no matter how big or small they are. So if a triangle were this big compared to if a triangle were this big, and if I know that this angle right here was 50, that means this angle was 40. Same thing here. If this was 50 and this one's 40, it does not matter. The ratio in between the side lengths will always be the same. The ratio of these three sides are the same, just like our special right triangles, except now we're not going to be dealing with square roots. We could remember if we have two sides, we can always find the third side by using the Pythagorean theorem, but we're not. So here are what our trigonometry ratios stand for. Here's the sine. Now, before you get into it, some person just came up with these three names. I could go into it. I'll have to research it more for you, though. And then this is the ratio of the two side lengths. Now, it's always based on the angle that you're talking about. So if I'm looking at sine of A, I first look at this sine of A right here, the angle A, and it's the length that's opposite of the angle. So my length that's opposite is A, and my length that is the hypotenuse would be C. I'm looking at cosine of A, so still looking at this angle. Cosine is the adjacent line to it. Now, if you go back to chapter 1, adjacent means it's right next to it, but not including the hypotenuse. Hypotenuse is always going to stay the same. The opposite and the adjacent, they switch it up sometimes depending on the angle you're talking about. So if you're looking at adjacent to A, which would be length B, and then your hypotenuse is still length C. Tangent, so then the ratio of sides for tangent is my opposite over my adjacent. Now you'll often hear me say SOHCAHTOA. So this is kind of just a shortcut to try to figure out what ratio I'm using. So the first letter will tell you the trig that you're using between it. So S stands for sine, C stands for cosine, T stands for tangent. The O is whatever on top of your ratio. So O is the opposite side. H stands for the hypotenuse side. That's always equal to the sine of that angle. So this stands for the sine of the angle, and this stands for the ratio. So this is the cosine of the angle. That's that first letter, and this is the ratio. Okay, so the first thing that you have to do is when I'm looking at this, what are the sine, cosine, tangent of the ratios for angle T? So if I look at angle T, here's my angle T. Now, one thing you should always do is label your sides. So if I look at this, my hypotenuse is right there. That's always the easiest one to label. So if I'm looking at angle T right here, my angle T, this would be considered the opposite for my angle T, and this would be my adjacent for angle T. So first you should label your sides hypotenuse, opposite, adjacent. Now when I do sine of T, that's going to be equal to my opposite, which is 8, over my hypotenuse, which is 17. If I'm looking at cosine of T, again, this is where you should be looking back. I do not expect you to just memorize this, but you should be looking back at these ratios right here. Cosine of your angle is your adjacent over your hypotenuse. And tan of your angle is equal to your opposite over your adjacent. If you can, you should always simplify your ratios. If you can't, that's fine. I want you to pause the video and do G. However, before we do that, notice when I'm looking at angle G, the first thing I do is label my sides. This is still my hypotenuse. That's not going to change. But now when I look at G, this becomes my opposite, and this becomes my adjacent, because opposite is opposite the angle you're talking about. So pause the video and try to do these three sine or trigonometry ratios for angle G. Sine is your opposite over your hypotenuse. Cosine is your adjacent, so 8 over your hypotenuse, and tangent is your opposite over your adjacent. So now we're going to get into actually solving some of these. So here are your 4 steps to start solving. Now when I'm writing this up, first thing I have to do is decide if this problem has sine, cosine, or tangent. So here's my angle. So if I label my sides, hypotenuse, because that's the easiest one to label, here's my opposite, and here's my adjacent. Again, I'm looking at SO, CA, or TOA. I have to first decide which trig ratio am I using. Well, if I'm looking for x, that means that for sure I have to use a. So these are the only two that have that a in it. And then if I also look at this picture, I have this value. That value is the opposite. So I'm looking O and A. Which trig function is O and A or A and O? That's this one. So I know for this first one, I'm going to be using TOA, which is tan. Okay, I'm using TOA, which is tan. So again, this part is tan of my angle. My angle is 15 here, is equal to my opposite, which is 10.2, because that's the opposite side over my adjacent. Okay, that's that second step. First, figure out which trig function, write up your proportion. Now, this is important to know that when you're looking at this number right here, this is just some sort of number, okay? It's also important to know if you have a graphing calculator, especially, you have to make sure you have your mode set correctly. So if I go to mode, you have to make sure that your degree is what you're in. Right now, I'm in radians, which will be something that you will learn when you're smarter and older. You're smart now, just be aware. So I'm going to switch it to degrees. I have to make sure that I'm in degrees. I'm not going to do anything with this number until the very end. So if I need to get rid of this x, I need to solve for x. First thing I want to do is get rid of this division. So I have to think, what's the opposite of dividing? Well, that would be multiplying, Mrs. Frickman. Well, golly gee jeepers, you are right. So now if I want that x all by itself, I have to think, okay, what's the opposite of multiplying? Well, the opposite of multiplying would be dividing. So whatever you do to one side, you do to the other. So again, this is where you have to remember this is just some number. Now, if I type this in, when you look at this, you have your sine, your cosine, your tangent. If I type in tangent 15, this is just the ratio of those two side lengths. This is some number. I don't want you to type it in like that, though. What you want to do is type this whole thing into your calculator. So 10.2 divided by tan of 15. Make sure to close that parenthesis. And then when I get this answer, it says round to the nearest hundredth, x is equal to, well, this is your 10th, this is 100th, this second 6 will knock that up. So this would be 38.07. I should look to see if I have units for my length, and I do. It's in feet. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. So again, this is step 1, this is step 2, this is step 3, and this is step 4. I want you to try to pause the video and try your hardest to try to do these steps, okay? Try to do one at a time. So it's telling us we're looking for QR. That's this length right here. So I have to figure out, it says sine, cosine, or tangent. Looking up there. I have my hypotenuse. I'm looking for my opposite. So I think, is that sine, cosine, or tangent? So I have my hypotenuse and opposite. So these two are opposite hypotenuse, so I'm going to be using so. So again, I want you to pause the video and try to set up your equation if you did not already do so. So we know it's so it's going to be sine of your angle is equal to your opposite, because that's your opposite, your unknown, over your hypotenuse. Now I want you to try to solve this. So pause the video. I need to get rid of this division. The opposite of dividing is multiplying. Now the difference between this problem, the problem that I did before, is the fact that once I did that multiplication up here, I didn't have x by itself. Okay, here when I multiply this over, I have x by itself now. So now I can go into my step 4. Now I can put this right into my calculator, and I get 12.9 times sine of 63, close my parenthesis, and I get that this is 11 well, we want to the nearest hundredth, so 11.49, because that 3 will keep it as a 9. And if I look at my units, these units are centimeters. And that's all we're going to do today. I know this is a lot. We will be practicing this in depth. So take a deep breath. If you stuck with me, I'm proud of you. You're that much smarter. You're that much more prepared for class. We're not going to do these now. We're going to do these in class for review. Have a wonderful day.